Hello and welcome to part 5 of my history of jazz, and we're going to be looking at the instrumentation of jazz. So jazz starts in the early days with New Orleans jazz with what is called a front line, which would be clarinet, trombone, and the lead instrument would be cornet or trumpet. You know, that's an instrumentation that you can march with. It's a marching band instrumentation. Following up behind, you can add some drums, you know, some snare drum, bass drums, you know. No double basses, no piano. You can't march down the road with those. And then they're not necessarily in early jazz music. You don't need them to make early jazz music. They often add, piano's often added. You know, Jelly Roll Morton being the great musician that brings in the arrangement aspects of the piano, you know, into jazz. Then that expands that into the big band, and the big band, which is basically like a sort of jazz version of an orchestra, you know, with lots of brass and lots of woodwind, not violins, but with you know, that front line expanded out into the jazz section, into the big band section. But the big bands pioneer something else, which is the rhythm section. Now there are rhythm sections. If you listen to Louis Armstrong's Hot Sevens, there's a rhythm section on there. But the big bands really formalise that. And what do they formalise? They formalise the drum kit. So the drum kit is basically a collection of marching instruments. Some genius at the turn of the 20th century realised that they could probably make some more money if they could play the bass drum and the snare drum at the same time. So they put the bass drum on the floor and they kicked it, and they called it the kick drum. In 1909, this way of playing had become so popular that Ludwig invented the bass drum pedal. So now you can play the bass drum with your foot at the same time as playing the snare drum. The Clash cymbals, right, they realised they can play those with a foot pedal, and they create what is called the low boy. And the low boy was a hi-hat like this. Oh, mine's not there. I'm pointing at my hi-hat stand, it's got no cymbals on. But the low boy was on the floor. It was, you know, about 18 inches off the ground. It wasn't designed to be played. But of course, the jazz musicians playing in a form which is alive, where you're allowed to do what you want and express yourselves, they start to play those cymbals. You know, early jazz musicians actually play with their right hand underneath their left hand. You can even see in the 40s, watch old Buddy Rich videos, you can see, rather than playing like that standard way, they're playing the other way around with their right hand under their left. You know, so they discover that people are playing the hi-hats, so they bring the hi-hats up, and in the 1920s, and suddenly you've got the hi-hats. Now, the thing with the drums is they're very, very loud. You can't record the drum kit in 1920s. You know, in the 1920s, you know, the microphone is not invented in 1925. When you're listening to original Dixieland jazz band recordings, you're listening to a big horn which is capturing the sound and physically wobbling a needle in a wax cylinder or some sort of cutting device, which is you know, cutting a scratch into something, which then when you turn that process around produces music. It's quite incredible, really, that there's no microphones on those early recordings. You know, listen to those King Oliver records from 1923, 24 with Lou. There's no microphone. And of course the drums, if you played them, would vibrate that cutting needle. So they always had to reduce the drums down. We don't really know what the drummers were doing on those early recordings. But once the microphone sets in, and also the big bands kick in, which are louder, the drums are able to do more. What the drummers do is they transfer the main rhythm from the snare drum, which I think is the early jazz marching thing, to the hi-hat, right? Because it's easier to be recorded and it cuts through and it doesn't upset the recording apparatus, right? And that's where you get that, right? And then the double bass. Now the double bass is a classical instrument. The drum kit is, you have snare drums in an orchestra, but it's really a marching instrument. So we have the drum kit, which is this collected together, you know, marching instruments. We've added cymbals to this. Do you know? Here's a fact people don't realise. The drum kit is one of the few percussion ensembles that mixes metals with membrane, you know, drums. Okay, most, you know, gamelan's all metal. You know, tabla is all drums. African music is all drums. You know, with the drum kit, you get this mix of all different instruments. Of course, you know, these the cymbals have come from China, and they've also come from Arabia. You know, the drums are really, you know, coming from African music. You know, this is a conglomeration. The drum kit's invented in the 20th century. It's a conglomeration. The swing bands really nail the drum kit, you know, as having a bass drum, a couple of toms, you know, a ride cymbal and hi-hats. And that goes with the piano. And the piano is coming out of sort of a ragtime boogie-woogie tradition. So there's a rhythmical aspect to the piano that's there. But as I was saying, the double bass comes in. And I think is it Jimmy Blanton, the bass. I've gone into an area in my mind where I've got a bit of encyclopedia up here. Count Basie's bass player, who's playing with Joe Jones. It could be Walter Page, it could be Jimmy Blanton. I don't know which one. You'll have to look it up. There's a little bit of a test for you. Sorry that my knowledge is just got to the limits. Like I say, these videos are like jazz. I make them up. You know, I don't prepare them. So. But the bass player in Count Basie's band starts to do walking bass lines. And once you've got the walking bass line and you've got the hi-hat drums with Joe Jones, you know, you have the rhythm section, a swinging, syncopated backbeat rhythm section. All right. Now, all the way through this, the guitar is not really a main instrument in jazz. We have the banjo in some of the sort of New Orleans jazz. You know, there's a banjo in the Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings. Throughout the 1920s, Eddie Lang and Lonnie Johnson are making acoustic guitar recordings, and they're really, really important. Louis Johnson really invents single line soloing on the guitar. Now that's an incredible achievement. You know, Lonnie Johnson should have his statues up all over the world because he invented the guitar solo. That really influences Django Reinhardt, that takes the guitar further out. You know, I mentioned Django in the video before. You know, the first international jazz superstar. But it's all acoustic guitar. You've got no chance of playing that in a big band. So the guitar doesn't take a hold. But in the 1930s, they started to invent workable electric guitars that will amplify. And we have one of the great geniuses in the 1930s emerging Benny Goodman band, which is the Charlie Christian. And Charlie Christian starts to really create a very sophisticated, you know, jazz guitar style. Now I say jazz guitar style, he's ahead of bebop. He's one of the bebop innovators. He's playing lines on the guitar that no one's really playing on any instrument. So that pioneering aspect of Charlie Christian, which other musicians must have checked out. I'm sure Charlie Parker would have been aware of Charlie Christian and heard what he was doing on that instrument, because the Benny Goodman records were selling a lot. And so that then puts the guitar onto the sort of stage. A lot of those blues musicians, you know, now here is something that's I find really interesting. You know, the early blues artists are urban blues artists. I've talked about this before. People like Leroy Carr, Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey. You know, they're very close to a sort of a big band jazz group or jazz ensemble. You know, but they're an urban blues. When those records started to sell, the record companies started to go, well, what else is out there? And they went and they found that there was a lot of busking musicians, which I believe are going around playing all sorts of music. But once they saw that there was a market for playing the blues, you know, people like Charlie Patton and Blind Lemon Jefferson, you know, started playing acoustic blues. That form is an authentic form. I'm not saying it's not an authentic form, but often I feel that it was manipulated by the powers that be. There was an elite there. There was a sort of educated elite that went looking for that music, and they found it because, you know, blues musicians being clever gave it to them. Check out the videos of Leadbelly. Leadbelly was a blues musician, was discovered by Alan Lomax in a prison. He was in prison for murder, but he was playing all these blues songs, and he was brought out of prison, and he's incredible, you know. And he basically, it was a revisionist way of looking at this guy and saying, look, this is now we can now track back and find out where this music came from, and it's like a historic thing. So Leadbelly, you know, had been a musician in the 1910s and 20s, but he found fame in the 1940s. But there's a video of him which I find quite upsetting, where he's basically apologising to being a murderer to these, you know, sort of white elite people, you know, the Alan Lomax and his dad, who had sort of rescued him from prison, and he's apologised for being that, and he says, I'm going to be a good boy now and just go out and play the blues, you know. So that style is incredible. You know, people like Robert Johnson are so important to music, but you've got to remember it wasn't popular at the time. But it was a guitar-based style. Now, the musicians that sort of pricked their ears up and went, oh my God, there's this thing happening in the blues, I'm going to go and do that. One of them was Muddy Waters. But Muddy Waters didn't just come back and deliver what they wanted. He changed the face of music because he electrified the blues in the 1940s. And he electrified the guitar. This is massively important. You know, then you have people like T-Bone Walker and B.B. King come in. But there's a really interesting interview with B.B. King where he's asked about his influences, and he mentions Django Reinhardt and he mentions Charlie Christian. You know, so the pioneering electric guitar sound, you know, mixed with the rhythm section, that is what we mean by electrification of jazz. That's what Muddy Waters did. It's not really an electrification. It's using the electric guitar with a jazz rhythm section, you know. Of course, that type of rhythm and blues, guitar, bass, drums, piano, is going to be revolutionary. Okay, now those are the instruments that really take over rock and roll. You know, and that comes straight from jazz. The drum kit is an invention of jazz. If you're a drummer in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and maybe even the 1960s, you're a jazz drummer. You're not a rock drummer, you're not a blues drummer. The early blues drummers, you know, people like Fred Bellow, they're Earl Palmer, they're all jazz drummers. You know, they could have sat as just the same in a jazz rhythm section. The double bass, which is a classical instrument, has been completely reinvented. It's playing walking bass lines, which is a jazz invention. The piano isn't a jazz instrument, but I would class the electric guitar as a jazz instrument, you know, with all the pioneering work coming from jazz and blues musicians. A lot of the way the guitar is going to be played, say in Elvis's band by Scotty Moore, or in Bill Haley's band, when you listen to that, that is a sort of mixture between jazz guitar and blues guitar, really coming through people like T-Bone Walker. So that's one of the great innovations of jazz is the instrumentation, you know. The drum kit is pretty much going to stay the same from the 1930s when the drum kit is nailed. You know, I could play a 1930s drum kit that Gene Krupa played now in a rock band. The guitar is going to advance. It's going to advance through people like, you know, Leo Fender and Les Paul. Les Paul, of course, is a Charlie Christian styled guitar player. So that influence is carrying on into the Les Paul guitar, the solid body guitar, but also the use of the recording studio. All this is coming out of jazz innovation. The double bass is going to get replaced in the late 50s by the electric bass. The electric bass pioneers, interestingly, are not necessarily going to be from jazz. This is one of the first instances where we can see, you know, the rock guys and the blues guys being ahead of the jazz guys. It takes a long time for the electric bass to make its mark back into jazz, which we really see in the fusion time. And a lot of the time that's people like David Holland and Ron Carter being asked by someone like Miles Davis to play electric bass. They're not, you know, comfortable doing it. You think of Rick Laird in the Mahavishnu Orchestra. He's a jazz double bass player. You know, he's played with Wes Montgomery, he's in the Ronnie Scott's House rhythm section, and then he's moved to electric bass. A lot of the early electric bass players in jazz and jazz fusion are double bass players that's moved across. Even Stanley Clarke is that. He's a double bass player that's moved across. It's not really to the mid-70s, I would say, that we start to see, you know, an originated jazz electric bass style. You know, I would say Steve Swallow would probably be one of the first bass players to really do that. This is really off the top of my head. I didn't think I was going to talk about this, but yeah, I would say Steve Swallow. And then, of course, it's people like Alphonso Johnson, and of course Jaco Pastorius and Stanley Clarke, although Stanley Clarke originates as a double bass player. But I would say someone like Jaco Pastorius, I don't think he played the double bass. I'm sure he could have, but I don't think he played the double bass. He originates as a jazz electric bass player. And that's really the instrumentation there, you know, which has that has come out of jazz. And I think this is one of the great innovations. A lot of the time when you're looking at popular music, yes, there's other forms in there. There's country music in there. There's gospel in there. There's musical theatre influences in there. But one of the great gifts of jazz is the instrumentation. When you look at the Beatles, they're playing 2 electric guitars, a bass and drums. And that has come from nowhere else but jazz. And I think that's a really interesting thing. As jazz has developed, I think the real innovation that then comes in terms of instrumentation is the fusion period. Now, of course, as I've said elsewhere, jazz fusion isn't liked by critics. They never want to admit that jazz fusion's done anything, but so much innovation that appears in rock music and popular music later on starts off with jazz fusion. I would imagine, for example, the use of the double bass drum. The double bass drum, which is using 2 drums, really is invented by Louis Bellson in the Duke Ellington big band. He had a dream because he was a tap dancer, of being able to have 2 bass drums. The double bass drum then became a stock instrument in the Duke Ellington band, and people like Sam Woodyard also played double bass drum. That develops, rock musicians who would come through a big band route, like someone like Ginger Baker, would have been aware of what Louis Bellson was doing. So he starts to play double bass drum in the 60s. But the language of double bass drum really doesn't advance particularly until Billy Cobham comes out in the Mahavishnu Orchestra. And that's where you really see someone intelligently using the double bass drums. If you listen to Cobham's solo on One Word off Birds of Fire, that solo lists directly stuff from Louis Bellson's solo off the live Duke Ellington album. So that language of double bass drum comes with that. As we've said before, the language of electric bass is really influenced by jazz fusion, and that's really through people like Jaco Pastorius expanding on the language of it. Of course, so slap bass, that comes firmly from the rock world, that comes from Larry Graham's Sly Stone, but Stanley Clarke then takes that and moves it on. But Jaco Pastorius, he really utilises harmonics, 3-note per string technique, advanced double fingering to expand out the language of the electric bass. But the electric guitar has been pushed forward so often by jazz fusion musicians. The jazz fusion musicians in the 60s and 70s are so far ahead of the rock guys. Larry Coryell and then John McLaughlin and Alan Holdsworth. All those musicians, Al Di Meola, John Schofield, and these are all 70s musicians, Pat Metheny, all of those in their own way are way past any rock musician of that time. All right? Take someone like John McLaughlin. John McLaughlin is really pioneering an alternate picking style, which has come through people like Tal Farlow, but it advances to a point where he can really operate the guitar at high speeds, but also he can operate at high speeds on other scales, non-blues scales. He's got the blues in there, but he's also got all of these synthetic scales and other, sort of Indian modal scales in there. And of course, that's going to influence rock music. They can't keep up. The rock guys can't keep up. You don't see the influence of John McLaughlin, what John McLaughlin's doing, say, in 1970, until we see the sort of fast-picking guitars like Yngwie Malmsteen in the early 80s, like a 10-year lag. Jazz guitarists like Lenny Breau, I really think that Lenny Breau is one of the greatest guitarists ever of all time. I would say Alan Holdsworth, Lenny Breau, are my two, not my favourite guitarists, but they're the 2 guitarists that I would rate as being so great that it's really hard to touch them. Lenny Breau is a jazz guitarist that emerges in the late 60s. He emerges sort of finger-picking style from Chet Atkins with a sort of flamenco classical style, but also with jazz guitar, with a sort of influence of a sort of Bill Evans harmonic style. And Lenny Breau is so incredible that I don't think other guitarists can actually be influenced by him, because it's so incredible what he's doing on all levels. I'm not just about technically, but I'm on about up here as well. Someone like Alan Holdsworth, of course, has had many people try to copy his style, but they never can, you know. So this is one of the things about influence, especially instrumental influence, is that so often it's really difficult to achieve that. Anyway, I think I've talked enough about the influence of jazz instrumentation. I hope you enjoyed the video. So if you like it, you know, like it and subscribe it, and I'll see you for the next part of my history, where I'm going to be looking at fusion or free jazz.